In the autumn of 1994, Margaret Hale stood at the auction barn in Carbon County, Montana, and bought 33 sheep that no one else wanted. They were the last lot of the day. The auctioneer had already sold the good stock: the Dorset crosses with full fleeces and straight legs, the Rambouillet ewes that had tested clean for brucellosis, the Suffolk rams that would fetch top dollar from the breeding programs in Wyoming. These 33 were what remained, a mixed flock of leftovers. Some had foot rot so advanced their hooves had curled upward like cinnamon sticks. Others had wool so matted with burdock and manure that they looked like walking compost piles. 2 were blind in one eye. One had a jaw broken years ago and healed crooked, giving it a permanent sneer. The auctioneer called them culls. The buyers in the crowd called them dog food. Margaret paid $11 a head, $363, for 33 animals that the veterinarian in attendance had already condemned. She wrote the check with a pen she kept in her coat pocket, the same pen she had used to sign her husband's death certificate 8 months before. "Ma'am," the auctioneer said, leaning on his podium while the crew loaded the sheep into her borrowed stock trailer, "you understand these animals aren't right? The foot rot on that group there, it's contagious. You bring that onto your property, you're risking your whole flock." "I don't have a flock," Margaret said. "Then what in God's name are you going to do with 33 sick sheep?" Margaret looked at the animals in the trailer. One of the blind ewes had pressed her face against the bars and was making a sound that was not quite a bleat, not quite a whimper. It was the sound of an animal that had been beaten too many times, that expected nothing good from human hands. "I'm going to fix them," Margaret said. She was 41 years old. She had been married to Daniel Hale for 19 years. They had run 300 head of cattle on the ranch. Daniel's grandfather had homesteaded in 1912, and they had been happy in the way that people are happy when they work hard and love each other and believe the future will be like the past, only a little better. Then Daniel had died of a heart attack while fixing fence in the north pasture, and the future had become something Margaret could not see at all. The cattle were gone by summer. She had sold them to pay the medical bills, the funeral costs, the back taxes that Daniel had always managed to keep current, but that she had let slide while she sat in the house and tried to remember how to breathe. The ranch was 2,000 acres of grassland and scrub. Too much for one woman who had never run it alone. Too little to attract the corporate buyers who were swallowing up the big spreads to the east. She had $300 in her checking account and a house full of Daniel's tools and clothes and the ghost of his presence in every room. She bought the sheep because the house was too quiet, because she needed something to care for that would care back, even if only by staying alive. Because she had read in a library book that sheep were flock animals, that they needed each other, that a single sheep would die of loneliness if left alone, and because, in the months after Daniel's death, she had learned what it meant to be alone. The drive back to the ranch took 2 hours. The sheep in the trailer made no sound. They stood pressed together, the sick ones leaning on the healthier ones, the blind ones navigating by smell and touch, a mass of wool and fear and resignation. When Margaret opened the trailer at the ranch, they did not run. They did not explore. They walked out in a tight cluster and stood in the dirt of the corral, waiting for whatever came next. Margaret named the blind ewe with the broken jaw Grace. She did not know why. The name came to her as she was mixing antibiotics into a bucket of grain, and she said it out loud, and the ewe turned her good eye toward the sound. And that was enough. She spent the first week just cleaning them. She sheared the matted wool herself with hand clippers, working in the barn with the door open to the September light. The fleeces underneath were ragged and thin, but they were clean. She trimmed the curled hooves with pruning shears, cutting away the rot until she reached pink, healthy tissue. She treated the eye infections with ointment from the feed store. She set the broken jaw as best she could with wire and hope, and she fed Grace mash through a tube for 3 days until the old ewe could eat on her own. The neighbors came on the 2nd day. Tom Brennan owned the spread to the west, 1,500 acres of irrigated hay ground that he ran with his 2 sons and a fleet of equipment that gleamed in the sun. He pulled his truck into Margaret's driveway and sat behind the wheel for a full minute before getting out. She met him at the corral fence, her hands still smelling of iodine and sheep dung. "Margaret," he said, "I heard you bought the culls from Carbon." "I did. 33 head. 33. Tom looked at the sheep in the corral, at Grace, standing apart from the flock because her jaw made it hard to eat quickly, and the others pushed her away. At a young ram with a limp so pronounced he walked in circles, at the ewes with their thin fleeces and their cautious eyes. "These animals are diseased," Tom said. "Foot rot spreads. Orf, pink eye. You bring that onto this range, you're not just risking your own operation, you're risking every sheep operation in 50 miles. "I don't have an operation, Tom. I have 33 sheep that needed someone. These sheep need a bullet, Margaret. I'm sorry to be blunt, but it's the truth. They're suffering, and you're going to lose money you don't have trying to save animals that were bred to be slaughtered." Margaret leaned on the fence. She had known Tom Brennan for 15 years. She and Daniel had gone to his daughter's wedding. She had babysat his grandchildren when his wife had surgery. She had thought he was her friend. "Daniel would have understood," she said. "Daniel would have told you the same thing I'm telling you. You can't farm on sentiment. You can't ranch on pity. These animals are a waste of your time and your land and whatever money you've got left. Thank you for your concern, Tom." "I'm not concerned, Margaret. I'm warning you. The Wool Growers Association meets next week. If you don't cull those animals properly, humanely, we're going to have to take action. Quarantine at minimum. Possible seizure if the disease is spread." He got back in his truck and drove away. Margaret stood at the corral fence until the dust settled, and then she went back into the barn and sat with Grace until it was dark. The Wool Growers Association voted to blacklist her on a Thursday night in the Grange Hall in town. Margaret was not invited to the meeting. She learned about it from Mary Ketchum, the postmistress, who handed her the letter with a look of genuine sorrow. The letter said that Margaret Hale was hereby declared a person of concern by the Carbon County Wool Growers Association. That her flock, the letter used the word flock, as if 33 culls could be called such a thing, was to be considered a biosecurity risk. That no member of the association was to sell her feed, breeding stock, veterinary services, or shearing services. That no member was to allow her animals to graze on association land, which included every water right and grazing lease in the county. Margaret read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket and drove home to feed Grace and the others. The isolation was immediate and complete. The feed store in town, run by a man named Frank DeWitt who had sold Daniel grain for 20 years, told her he couldn't fill her order. The veterinarian, a young woman fresh out of Colorado State who had treated Margaret's border collie the year before, stopped returning her calls. The shearer who came through every spring, a traveling crew of Basque men who had been working Montana since before Margaret was born, drove past her ranch without stopping. She learned to do everything herself. She bought feed from a mill 2 counties away, driving 4 hours each way in Daniel's old pickup, which burned oil and rattled on the highway. She learned to give injections, to set simple fractures, to recognize the early signs of pregnancy toxemia and hypocalcemia. She bought a used shearing handpiece from a man in Idaho and taught herself to shear by watching a VHS tape she ordered from a magazine ad. Her first attempts were bloody and uneven. By the third year, she could shear a ewe in 6 minutes. The sheep got better. Not all of them. 3 died in the first winter, 1 from pneumonia, 1 from a parasite load too heavy to treat, 1 from simple old age. Margaret buried them on the hill behind the house, near the spot where Daniel had proposed to her in 1974. But the others survived. The foot rot cleared up with persistent treatment. The eye infections healed. Grace's jaw never straightened, but she learned to eat mash and hay, and the special grain Margaret mixed for her, and she gained weight. And her fleece, when Margaret finally sheared it in the spring, was thick and white and surprisingly soft. By 1996, Margaret had 30 sheep. By 1997, she had 28, having lost 2 more to coyotes and 1 to bloat. She did not breed them. She had no ram, no intention of building a commercial flock. She kept them because they needed her, and because she needed them, and because the sound of their bells in the morning was the only thing that made the house feel less empty. The neighbors did not forget. Tom Brennan's sons, who were in their 20s now and ran the day-to-day operations, made a habit of driving past her property on the county road, slowing down to stare at the sheep in the pasture. They called her the sheep witch to her face at the gas station in town. They left dead coyotes on her fence posts with notes that said, "This could be your flock." Margaret pulled the coyotes down and buried them next to her failed sheep and said nothing. In 1998, the wolves came back. It started with rumors. A rancher in the Sweetgrass Hills, 50 miles north, lost 3 calves in one night. Tracks in the mud, big as a man's hand, with claw marks that sliced through the soil like knives. The Fish and Wildlife Service confirmed it. A breeding pair of gray wolves, dispersing from Canada, had established a territory in northern Carbon County. The reaction was immediate and violent. Ranchers who had spent decades fighting the federal government over grazing rights and water access found a common enemy. They organized hunts. They set traps. They called their congressmen and demanded that wolves be delisted, shot on sight, eradicated before they destroyed the cattle industry that had built Montana. Margaret followed the news with a strange detachment. She had no calves to lose. Her sheep were not worth the effort of a wolf pack that could take down elk and moose. She felt, in a way she could not explain, a kinship with the wolves. They were unwanted too. They were hunted and hated and blamed for problems they did not create. She found herself hoping they would survive. The pack grew. By the fall of 1998, there were 6 wolves, the breeding pair, and 4 pups. They stayed mostly in the national forest land to the west, where deer and elk were plentiful, and human contact was minimal. But in the hard winter of 1998-1999, when snow fell 4 feet deep and temperatures dropped to 30 below, the elk moved south and the wolves followed their food. In January 1999, Tom Brennan lost 12 calves in a single night. The wolves came through a fence he had thought was secure, killed the calves in the barn lot, and left most of the meat uneaten. It was a killing spree, not a hunt, the work of young wolves learning to kill, driven by hunger and instinct. Tom found the bodies at dawn, steam still rising from their throats, and he wept in the snow like a child. The hunt that followed was relentless. Federal trappers came with helicopters and radio collars. Local ranchers formed posses that rode the range at night with rifles and spotlights. The state legislature passed an emergency measure allowing wolves to be shot on private property without a permit. By March, 3 of the 6 wolves were dead. The breeding pair and 1 pup went deep into the forest and were not seen again. Margaret's sheep were untouched. She did not know why at first. The wolves had passed within a quarter mile of her property. She had found their tracks in the snow along her north fence line, a straight line of prints heading toward Tom Brennan's place, passing her land like a ship passing an island. She had waited for the attack, had lain awake at night listening for the sound of panicked sheep, the snarling of predators, the gunshots she would not fire because she had sold Daniel's rifles to pay the taxes in 1996. But the wolves never came. In the spring, when the snow melted and the grass greened and the ranchers gathered at the Grange Hall to discuss the wolf problem, Margaret learned why. A wildlife biologist from the university, studying the WolfPack's movements before they were killed, had presented a report to the county commission. The wolf, he said, had established a travel pattern that avoided certain properties. Not randomly, consistently. They had passed within sight of Margaret Hale's sheep pasture multiple times and had never approached. They had killed cattle on Tom Brennan's land, sheep on the McAllister spread to the east, goats on the old Miller place. But they had left Margaret's 33 sheep alone. The reason, the biologists speculated, was the dogs. Margaret did not own dogs. She had never owned dogs. Daniel had been allergic, and after his death she had not wanted the complication. But in the summer of 1995, a strange thing had happened. A dog had appeared at her barn one morning, thin and scarred and wild-eyed. A mix of breeds so indeterminate that the vet she finally managed to get on the phone guessed it was part Great Pyrenees, part Anatolian, part something else entirely. It did not approach her. It did not bark. It simply took up residence in the barn, sleeping in the hay, and when Margaret tried to shoo it away, it looked at her with yellow eyes that held no fear and no submission. She named him Keeper. She did not feed him at first, thinking he would leave if there was no food. He did not leave. He hunted rabbits in the fields. He drank from the creek, and he watched the sheep. By 1996, there were 2 dogs. Keeper had found a mate somewhere, a rangy female with one ear torn half off, who appeared one morning and stayed. Margaret named her Grace after the ewe, though she did not know why she kept naming things after each other. The dogs did not belong to her. She could not touch them. If she walked toward them, they retreated to the edge of the pasture and watched her from a distance. But they did not leave, and they did not let anything else approach the sheep. Coyotes, which had been a problem in the first winter, stopped coming. The dogs killed 2 in Margaret's presence, quick and efficient, and left the bodies at the fence line as warnings. A black bear that wandered down from the hills in the fall of 1997 was met by a wall of barking and flashing teeth that sent it scrambling back into the trees, and the wolves, tracking through the snow in the winter of 1999, had encountered the same barrier. The biologist's report said the WolfPack had likely assessed the risk. 2 large guardian dogs, experienced and territorial, protecting a flock in open pasture with good sight lines. The wolves were hungry, but they were not desperate. They had chosen easier prey. Margaret read the report in the library in town because she still could not get the newspaper delivered to her house. She sat in the reading room for an hour. The report spread on the table in front of her, and she cried, not for herself, not for the sheep, for Keeper and Grace, who had come from nowhere and asked for nothing, and had given everything they had to protect something that the world considered worthless. She drove home and walked to the barn. Keeper was there, older now, gray around the muzzle, his scarred body thinner than it had been. He did not come to her, he never had. But he watched her approach, and when she sat in the hay 10 feet from him and said, "Thank you," he wagged his tail once, a brief thump against the barn floor, and closed his eyes. The story should have ended there. In a just world, it would have. The wolves were dead or gone. The sheep were safe. The dogs had proven their worth, and Margaret had proven hers. And the neighbors should have come to her with apologies and offers of friendship and acknowledgement that they had been wrong. They did not come. In the spring of 1999, Tom Brennan filed a complaint with the county sheriff. He alleged that Margaret Hale's dogs were a danger to the community, that they had killed livestock. He cited the coyotes, though coyotes were not livestock, that they were feral, unvaccinated, unlicensed, and running at large, that they had attacked his own dog when it strayed onto her property, which was true, though the dog had survived with stitches and a lesson about boundaries. The sheriff, a man named Bill Harker, who had known Daniel Hale since grade school, came to Margaret's door with the complaint in his hand and embarrassment in his eyes. "Margaret," he said, "I don't want to do this, but Tom's got a lawyer. He's got the wool growers behind him. They're saying those dogs are a menace. They protect my sheep," Margaret said. "They're not your dogs, Margaret. You can't even touch them. Legally, they're strays, and strays that kill other animals get put down. Then arrest me," Margaret said. "Charge me with something. But those dogs saved my flock from wolves, while Tom Brennan's calves were being slaughtered in his barn lot. If he wants to blame someone for his losses, he should blame himself for not having dogs of his own." Bill Harker did not arrest her. He gave her 30 days to license the dogs, vaccinate them, and confine them to her property. If she could not do that, he would have to call animal control. She could not do it. Keeper and Grace would not let her touch them, would not enter a kennel, would not tolerate a leash. They were wild things that had chosen to stay, not pets that had been trained. She spent the 30 days trying, leaving food in traps, attempting to gentle them with patience they did not want. On the 31st day, animal control came with a tranquilizer gun and a cage on a flatbed truck. Keeper was shot in the shoulder. He went down snarling, his teeth still bared, his eyes still fierce. Grace ran. They did not find her for 3 days, and when they did, she was in the barn, lying across Grace the ew's body, protecting her even in her terror. The ewe was unharmed. The dog was trembling so hard her teeth chattered. They were taken to the pound in Billings. Margaret was told she could reclaim them if she paid the fees, built a proper kennel, and proved she could control them. The fees were more than she had. The kennel would cost thousands, and control was something that had never existed between her and those dogs. She went to the pound every day for a week. She sat outside their cage and talked to them through the bars. Keeper, sedated and confused, did not recognize her. Grace pressed her body against the concrete wall and would not look at her. On the 8th day, she came and they were gone. The shelter had euthanized them that morning. Keeper had bitten a handler. Grace had stopped eating. They were deemed unadoptable, unmanageable, unsafe. The paperwork said, "Owner surrender," though Margaret had never surrendered anything. She had simply failed to save them, as she had failed to save Daniel, as she had failed to save the 3 sheep in the first winter, as she had failed at everything that mattered. She drove home in silence. She did not cry. She had no tears left. She walked to the barn, where Grace the ewe was waiting, and she sat in the hay and said nothing until it was dark. The wolves came back in 2001. Not the same pack. A new pair, younger, more desperate, pushed out of their territory in Canada by a larger pack with better hunting grounds. They crossed into Montana in October, moving south along the Rocky Mountain front, killing livestock with the reckless efficiency of animals that had not yet learned to fear humans. The ranchers were ready. The federal government had delisted wolves in the state. Hunting was legal, encouraged, celebrated. Tom Brennan had a wolf tag on his truck bumper and a rifle in his window rack. The posses formed again, but this time they were official, sanctioned, part of a state management plan that treated wolves as vermin to be eradicated. Margaret did not join. She did not own a rifle. She did not hate the wolves. She sat on her porch and listened to the distant gunshots and felt nothing at all. In November, the new pack found her. She was feeding the sheep in the barn lot when she heard it, a sound she had never heard before but recognized instantly, the high, keening howl of a wolf calling to its mate. The sheep heard it too. They froze, heads up, nostrils flared, the ancient prey response awakening in their domesticated brains. Then they ran. Not scattered, not panicked, but in a tight cluster, pressing together, the strong ones surrounding the weak. Grace the ewe in the center where her crooked jaw would not slow the group. Margaret ran with them. She had no plan, no weapon, no thought except to get to the barn, to close the door, to protect what she had spent 7 years rebuilding. She heard the wolves behind her, the sound of their paws on the frozen ground, the huff of their breath. She did not look back. She reached the barn ahead of the sheep, threw open the door, and stood in the entrance, her arms spread, her body between the flock and the predators. The sheep poured past her, wool brushing her legs, the smell of their fear thick and sour. And then they were inside, and she was alone in the doorway, facing 2 wolves that had stopped 20 feet away, their yellow eyes fixed on her, their bodies low and tense. She should have died. She knew it. The wolves were lean with winter, hungry enough to take risks. She was an old woman with empty hands and a heart that had been broken so many times it no longer knew how to fear, but she did not run. She stood in the doorway and looked at them. And she said, "No," not shouted, not threatened, just no. The same word she had said to Tom Brennan, to the wool growers, to the world that had tried to take everything from her. No, you cannot have them, not these sheep. Not these broken, worthless, beautiful animals that no one wanted and everyone laughed at. They are mine. I saved them. They saved me. And you will not take them. The wolves watched her. She watched them. The moment stretched, thin and sharp as a wire. Then the lead wolf, the male, bigger, scarred across the nose from some fight in his past, turned his head. He looked past her, into the barn, at the sheep huddled in the darkness. He sniffed the air, and he whined. It was not a hunting sound. It was not a threat. It was confusion, hesitation, the sound of an animal encountering something it did not understand. Margaret understood. She stepped aside, slowly, carefully, and let him see. The sheep were pressed together in a corner, their bodies forming a solid mass of wool and muscle. In the center, visible between their legs, was Grace the ewe. Her blind eye was closed. Her good eye was open, watching the wolf with an expression that was not fear. It was recognition. It was memory. It was the look of an animal that had survived too much to be afraid anymore. The wolf looked at Grace. Grace looked at the wolf, and the wolf turned away. He walked back to his mate. They touched noses. And they left, their tracks in the frost the only evidence they had been there. Margaret closed the barn door and sat down in the dirt and wept for the first time since Daniel died. The story spread. Not because Margaret told it. She told no one, not for weeks, but because Tom Brennan, riding his fence line the next morning, had seen the wolves leaving her property and had followed their tracks to her barn. He had found her sitting in the dirt, her face streaked with tears and dirt and snot, and he had helped her up, and she had told him everything. He told his sons. They told their friends. The story passed through the county like a grass fire, changing with each telling. Some said Margaret had talked to the wolves. Some said the sheep had fought them off. Some said Daniel's ghost had appeared with a rifle and scared them away. But the core of it remained. The wolves had come, and the sheep had survived. And the woman everyone had mocked had been right about something they could not explain. Tom Brennan came to her house in December. He brought a Christmas ham and a bottle of whiskey and an apology that took him an hour to get out. He told her he had been wrong about the sheep, wrong about the dogs, wrong about her. He told her that his own flock, The 200 Rambouillet ewes he had bought with borrowed money in 1997 had been hit by the wolves 3 nights after they left her place. He had lost 40 head. He had stayed up all night with a rifle and had killed 1 wolf, a young female, but the rest had escaped. He had not had dogs. He had not had anything but fences and guns, and the belief that he could control the wild world with force. "I need your help," he said. "I need to know how you did it, how you kept them safe, what I'm doing wrong." Margaret poured him coffee. She told him about Keeper and Grace, the dogs she had failed to save. She told him about the Guardian breeds, the Great Pyrenees and Anatolians and Maremas that had protected flocks in Europe and Asia for thousands of years. She told him that dogs were not tools to be bought and trained and discarded. They were partners. They chose to stay or they chose to leave, and the only way to keep them was to give them something worth protecting. "I don't have dogs," she said. "I have sheep that no one wanted, and for a while I had dogs that no one wanted, and together we kept each other alive." Tom listened. He did not understand everything, but he understood enough to go home and sell 2 of his tractors and buy 4 Guardian dog puppies from a breeder in Idaho. He built a barn lot where the dogs could live with the sheep from birth, where they would bond with the flock and learn to protect it as their own. He named the first one Margaret, which made Margaret Hale laugh for the first time in years. By 2005, there were Guardian dogs on 15 ranches in Carbon County. By 2010, there were 50. The wolf population stabilized, not eradicated, but managed, coexisting with livestock in a way that would have seemed impossible in the panic of 1999. The Wool Growers Association, which had blacklisted Margaret in 1995, invited her to speak at their annual meeting in 2008. She declined. She had nothing to say to them that her life had not already said. Grace the ewe died in 2003 at the age of 12, ancient for a sheep. Margaret buried her on the hill, near Daniel and the others. The flock, which had been 33, was down to 19 by then. She did not replace them. She let the numbers fall naturally, the old dying, the young surviving, until by 2010 she had 11 sheep left, all of them descendants of the original culls, all of them healthy and strong and unafraid. She died in 2012 at the age of 59 of ovarian cancer that she had ignored for too long, because she had been busy with lambing season and did not have time for doctors. Tom Brennan spoke at her funeral. He said she had taught the valley something about value, that worth was not determined by auction prices or breed standards or the opinions of neighbors, that sometimes the most broken things were the most worth saving, that a woman with 11 sheep and no friends had changed the way an entire county raised livestock. The ranch was sold to a young couple from Oregon who had read about Margaret in a magazine article and wanted to continue her work. They kept the sheep. They planted a hawthorn hedge along the north fence line, though they did not know why hawthorns mattered, only that Margaret had mentioned them once to a visitor as something she wished she had planted for the birds. The wolves still pass through. The Guardian dogs still watch, and in the barn, on a nail above the stall where Grace the ewe used to sleep, there is a photograph. It shows an old woman with gray hair and weathered hands, standing in a pasture with 11 sheep around her feet. She is not smiling. She is looking at something beyond the camera, something in the distance, with an expression that is not quite hope and not quite resignation. It is the look of someone who has been laughed at and mocked and isolated, and who has survived anyway. The look of someone who knows that the wolves are always coming, and that the only answer is to stand in the doorway and say no. She adopted 33 sickly sheep. The neighbors mocked her, until the WolfPack arrived, and the wolves always arrive.